Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session in June 2023. And this is me doing a bit of a research brain dump and some cool examples on how I've been using ChatGPT and some ideas for how it can be used for security teams and kind of what my thoughts on some of the next steps that we're going to see. So you probably heard of ChatGPT, it's basically unless you live on the rock. But I think the changes, it's like everything. It's one of those where there's a lot of hype, but I do feel that there's a couple of interesting properties that are making a big difference this time around. An interesting example is last time we had a big sort of paradigm shift, let's say, with the internet arriving. Most of the bigger companies, the well-funded companies, the companies that had a lot to gain from it, but also that had to change. They were all out, probably say pre-internet. They were all different sectors. They really didn't see it coming. And also initially they didn't see it as a threat. So that's why in a way the internet was able to grow at a certain pace. And then of course, then those smallish companies at the time end up being the giants that they are now, and they took over a lot of the other companies. What I think you have now is that you have a massive paradigm, but some of the biggest companies in the world are those tech giants who still have the culture of innovation, who still know how to leverage technology, where technology change is part of their DNA. And that's a big difference. And they are the ones driving this. And that's why you can see the, almost this exponential evolution of companies making massive bets on basically GPT-like technologies, the generative AIs, the LLMs, etc. So, of course, ChatGPT is the best case study, but there's tons of them from all the different players. So actually, before I want to go to the other bit, and that slide's out of order, so I'll come back to it. Actually, let me just fix that quickly, because that's here. It does go wrong. So it's important. This is just a tool. It's a tool, and it does have hallucinations, although this is basically it's a fancy word for making shit up, right? But it's also important to understand the difference between the models. So, for example, let's take a quick look between the 3.5 and the 4.0 GPT. So, if you ask, "Who am I?" right, to GPT-4, you basically get something like this, right? Nice compliments. Advocate open source, influence position, chief security officer, probably chief information security officer. Actually. Well, this is wrong. This is the wrong one. Oh, wait, give me a second. I need to change this because that one is the wrong one. So let me just quickly fix the slides. I'm going to pause the recording and then come back in just a second. Cool. Sorry, we're back. Sorry, wrong screenshot. Okay, so going back, we're talking about hallucinations. This is when ChatGPT gets it wrong. So here's an example of, getting it right reasonably, nice compliments, experience, number of source projects, board member. To be honest, I mainly was OWASP with different companies, public speaker. That's cool. This is actually correct. Just about, just realized this is actually wrong. I wrote books, but not this one. So again, this is already the latest one, having a bit of a crazy stuff, etc. But if you go to 3.5, it's even more crazy. Right, it comes here and it says I was the CSO of Mozilla. This was not me, and principal security engineer at Google, again, not me, and co-founder. That's a stretch. I wouldn't call myself a co-founder, right? So it's a bit like saying, like, what the hell, right? Like, where did he got this from, right? Pretty crazy shit here. So again, always take it with a pinch of salt. Always double check it, and then, and also use 4.0. And by the way, if you're not paying for the latest version, it's not that expensive. I kind of advise because it's worth and it's faster, etc. So again, it goes crazy. And the more you understand how it works, the more you understand why it happens. And it's important to see, sometimes take that into account. Now, here's a really cool worldly map that was created that I want to just basically show why I believe in the security industry. We're going to have a massive paradigm shift in the not just paradigm shift. We're going to have a massive evolution in the next 3, 6, 12, 24 months. I think it's more of a case of who gets there first. It's literally it's a if not a when, and some companies might get lucky because there's less movement in the areas, and others might be completely accelerated, and depends a lot what they do. So what's really cool about this map is that we were just doing the typical worldly map of needs from executives. This, I think, was on risk management and risk sort of, how you manage organizations. So you can see we got the top level risk exploits, the P&L and compliance, which is one interesting way to see the executives. Fundamentally, they care about the P&L, the compliance, and then we were mapping their risk appetite. And then here you have acceptance risk, risk acceptance, which is a big thing for me right now. Risk transfer mitigation. You can kind of come down, and then you got reporting, asset management, etc. What was interesting is that we end up connecting a lot of these to these security LLMs, which are very custom built. The big difference, and this is the key thing, and this is why Worldly Maps allows us to understand what happens next, is that 6 months ago, this LLM bit was way over here, was basically very immature. So you could argue that, well, yeah, you can build security language models, but it wouldn't scale because you didn't have basically the capabilities and the foundation and also the scale. And you almost had to build your own LLMs like ChatGPT equivalent in order to pull it off. It's not to say that it wasn't fully possible, but it was really hard. And in a way, you can argue that these LLMs in the past was pushing this guy a bit to the left. So this was even more to the genesis than he was than is now. What has happened is because of cloud infrastructure, because of the big developments, and of course you could expand why LLMs have also, you could just do a graph on LLMs, but now they're all the way to the right. So what's going to happen is you're going to see a massive push from security LLMs, i.e. even custom versions of them, evolving in the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. And what it means is they're going to have a massive impact in all these areas, from SOC tools to monitoring, to risk awareness, to risk register, SOC controls, reporting, risk frameworks, all of this, right? And now the only two interesting plays that companies in this space or teams, even security teams in this place, is they can either double down on what they do right now, hoping that they're able to leverage the security LLMs when they come along, or they really focus on the security LLMs and make sure they are the one disrupting their market. So they leverage the knowledge that they still have and the relationships that they still have. But they risk becoming like Blockbuster, where something came along very fast. Maybe an analogy here is that imagine if broadband went from here to there in 6 months or in 3 months, and that's kind of what has happened. Broadband killed Blockbuster, but it did it slowly a bit, right? Which is why they could have played very differently. So this is kind of why I feel that there's a lot of innovation going to happen here, and I think there's a lot of amazing things that we always want to do in security that it was simply not possible. There's lots of things from identity access management, threat modeling, analysis, stakeholder management, all sorts of things that in the past, even vulnerability assessment, of course, application security practices, that I always, had a worry in the back of my mind that says, this doesn't scale without massive teams, doesn't scale without massive evolutions, and the technology usually wouldn't help because they were very, almost primitive. They would do some stuff, but they never really scratch the surface. So let's start with a simple example, which I think is a really powerful way of thinking about what you can do with ChatGPT. So in this case, what we have here is I'm going to look at the top 10, right? And the top 10, this is I need to put a link here. I saw this guy do this on a tweet, which is really cool. It said, can you explain the OWASP top 10 to a 5-year-old? And that's a really cool way of thinking about it, which basically is simplify it and say, okay, let's say, how do you do it to a 5-year-old that you would go? And this is all about going into context. And in a couple examples, I'm going to get more business focused. But this is one of the powers of ChatGPT or these LLM worlds, is that you can basically really work hard on the prompting, on the setting the context, who you are or what you want it for. So you can see in this case is you have a toy castle, you want to keep it safe from friends that want to play with it. So it goes for every one of these elements. And this is, again, there's a big difference between 3.5 and 4.0. This is done on 4.0, right? You can see injection is like your friend found a secret word that made the castle doors open. They say the word they're in, right? Broke authentication when your friend steals a secret password. There's your exposure. If your favorite toy in the castle and your friends found it, so it's exposed. I like this one. I even like the humor of it. Look, this is a bit tricky, right? But imagine if your friends could make your castle, show them the hidden treasure. That's a way of thinking about this. So it's really, really cool, right? I like, look at this one, composed with non-vulnerability. It's like a part of your castle was known to break easy and your friend knew about it and used it to get inside, right? So it's really a great way of of thinking about and presenting, something like the OS top 10. So let's then look at, okay, what about a grumpy teenager, right? So, what would a grumpy teenager would do? And then you could notice the language is a bit more older, less childy, but again, like, something using cheat codes on your favorite video games. Look at the context that he has, right? Really cool, not cool, right? It's like finding your phone's passcode and snooping around your messages, major privacy. So you could see the, sort of different type of context that he's able to provide. And, it's really, super powerful, like to really think about who is your audience. So now let's go to a more realistic. So what about to a CTO or C-level exec that has technical expertise, but not necessarily a security expert, which is something that we all experience day to day. So there you go, right? So now you could see that is a lot more technical explanation. Malicious data to your system, it tricks you to perform actions you shouldn't, data loss, corruption, exposure. Look, that is avoiding security specific references. It's basically talking about something that a technical person will think about: data corruption, unauthorized access, regulatory fines, internal reconnaissance, perform remote code execution, system compromise. These are things that a senior exec should understand. But for example, a board member shouldn't. So let's look now at, for example, okay, what about a CEO or board member that doesn't now have security expertise, and then focus on why they should care. So this is different. Right now, it's about, look at the language is much less technical. It's a lot more business on business focus. Tricking your company into giving away confidential information, lead to data breaches, check who's who, doesn't protect sensitive data properly, isn't keeping a close eye on their systems. So it's really cool. In fact, this is a hell of a last paragraph. Even if you're not a technical expert, it's important to understand those risks, because you can have, they can have serious impact in how you operate in the financial systems. So in a way, look at the last line. It's about protecting your business, which of course is very relevant to CEO or board members. And then I even took the next level and say, okay, now let's say for the same CEO board member with limited security resources, for which top 10 can you provide an analogy? So now I'm actually even looking for business examples outside of security. So now you could see injection. Imagine convince your assistants, give them confidential business information. It's like an office security guard lets somebody in, right? You could see the examples. The employees, regardless of their role, could walk into the CEO office and like broken access control. Great example. Imagine if, employees, regardless of their role, could walk into the CEO's office and look at papers on the desk, right? So really cool way to start presenting the data. So what you just see in these very simple examples is, in a way, the power of what's already exists. Now, I think in the medium term, what's coming next, which is even more interesting, is when you can feed it lots of your own data and have it in almost like by the time you hit the prompt, you already have a lot of data that's in there. But at the moment, just the information that exists in there, and I didn't put an example here, but I'll do it next time, where I already done some really cool mappings on, for example, taking a particular scenario and then mapping to the NIST framework, or asking about risks. Why does this matter? And then getting lots of really great materials and information about the risk structure. So, super powerful examples. Now, let's now look at a more technical analysis. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to show you a thread. And what I want to walk you through is also the kind of dialogue that you can have with ChatGPT, the kind of analysis that I can now do. And it doesn't mean that I expect the answer to be 100% correct, but it saves me tons of time, but also it already picks up lots of things that sometimes are not that easy to spot, right? So, and also from a learning point of view, it's pretty insane. So what you see here is a chat. And by the way, the latest version of ChatGPT allows you to do this, which allows you to take a chat and then just share it, which is actually super powerful. It does introduce some concerns about the security of what they've done, but at least they have a GUI there, so at least it's not like, I'll be worried if you look like this, right? where you basically have sequential things. So at least somebody on the other side is protecting against the most fundamental issues. Okay, so what I've done here was I went back to Hack Me Bank. If you don't know, it's a great vulnerable by design application. I actually wrote this version, so I know it really well. It takes me back to 2008, which is quite funny. But basically, it's an interesting application because there's a front end on the banking, and then there's a web services behind the scenes. And there's a number of vulnerabilities that he had. So I kind of wanted to take a look at it. So what I've done here was And by the way, again, there's ways to do this through APIs, and the Copilot stuff that you now see from GitHub and others are doing similar things, right? So I went to ChatGPT and says, hey, can you find the vulnerability in this ASPX code behind page? Again, look at the fact that I didn't have to explain what ASPX, I didn't have to explain what code behind this. It already, in a way, has that understanding. So there's a bunch of problems here, right? For the eagle eye, is fundamentally here. You can see that we're basically building HTML by hand, something that we should never do, and introduce a bunch of vulnerabilities. Now, what's cool about it is here's a great answer, right? Based on that ASPX code behind, here's a potential, although he still go few potential, but I would argue they actually are real, where you could see problem validation. But look, the context, like this is the, think about how much time this saves. It says data validate the input for this part and that before they use this. If in the past, to try to create things like this would be very hard, even programmatically, right? So it's a great example of basically understanding better. And then you got indirect object references, again, spot on. User ID from the sessions goes direct to the post message, which is one of the vulnerabilities in Hack Me Bank. Yep, information disclosure. There's a bit of details there. And this is quite a sweet one, right? Again, this is all the code. He almost goes and say, hey, you're actually using ADO.NET, which by the way, at the time was state of the art, but to access low level, right? He's actually correct. The engine is actually very correct at using ORM. I think they called Lambda at the time in .NET is much better model because it prevents a lot of the injections. And nice recommendations. Input validation, parameterized queries, strong authentication, really, really nice stuff, right? Now, what I then do is says, okay, I'm now going to show you the backend code. So same for these files. So this is one of the backend codes in a way it's called Data Factory. It's the one that centralizes a lot of the SQL. So again, for the eagle eyes, you see that this is where a lot of the SQL injection or example is, right? By the way, this was a vulnerable by design application where you concatenate the field that you get from here. And this is also what I call a vulnerable by design function. Although this function is not directly connected to the outside world or web service, is now pushing the requirement to do the right thing to the ones above. And that said, on SQL injection, there's no reason to ever do this because you should be using parameterized queries. But and then what's cool about it is you could see I put the information there, and then nice meaty source code, and then there you go. So based on provided code above, here's a vulnerability. SQL injection, absolutely correct. Lack of input validation, absolutely correct. Authentication authorization, again. This is actually quite clever, right? It does not. You notice that it does not include any explicit authentication authorization check, right? Like for example, methods like create user and delete user should include a proper authentication, and that's a good example of something that you see a lot in web services, where the web services provide functionality and they almost delegate upwards the correct usage of those APIs from a security point of view, which is very, very dangerous. What you want to see is deep down the code. You want to see the ability to make sure that you still know who is actually calling you, right? And again, some hard-coded stuff that shouldn't be there, right? So basically, nice recommendations. And then the next use case is more interesting because one of the things that happens, and when I design Hack Me Bank, is one of the cool examples, is there's actually paths. And when I was doing my O2 platform stuff, you guys take a look at that, we're actually visualizing this. There's a really cool visualizations and basically the reality of basically payloads that they submit on the front end UI that then get called on the web server. So they're not validated or sanitized in the UI, at least as a first level of protection. And then they end up hitting web services methods that are vulnerable to certain vulnerabilities, for example, SQL injection. So I'm now wanting to see, can ChatGPT pick that up? So I said, okay, so basically I went, the code above is exposed via WSDL, web services, from the UI, here's the code behind that handles the user management. But look at how I'm speaking, right? I'm basically providing almost context. I'm basically saying, hey, now look at this, look at that, and look at how powerful this is. And now I'm saying, can you find vulnerabilities in the code? And find vulnerabilities where the code below is used to trigger vulnerabilities in exposed web services. So this is now the front-end code that I put in here. And then, correctly, it found the vulnerabilities in just the front end. But then on the back end, what's interesting is that it basically says we need to examine the implementation. So it's actually saying, hey, basically ChatGPT is saying, hey, man, you haven't gave me this and you haven't gave me that, right? So if you can give me this, then, can take a look at it. So it's a good example of, it knew that hey, from the front end, it's going to hit here, but it depends what happens on the next bit. So that's where I go, okay, actually, that's sure. So the WS management is configured like this. So there's the config file, which basically points. So this is me now saying to the user management ASMX web service, which is that page, which is fundamentally is the code for, which is used by the code behind, which you can see here, there. And that's where a lot of the vulnerabilities exist, right? In fact, what you can see here, you can see that this web service, again, very common, is just a little wrapper for the data factory. So you can see that a lot of the stuff that goes there is called from here, right? So you can see that data factory, a lot of these are just wrappers for the data factory, which you already provided above. And now based on this, he found some information, lack of input validation, but and then I said, well, okay, but can you see a path for SQL injection, right? And then it kind of does here, but he actually haven't found. So it tells me the parameterize. So what now he found? He found the SQL injection, and he provides a really good code snippet where it says, here's the web method, which is what I was showing you guys. The created user, for example, you can see the session ID and the username are here. This is actually code samples from the real code. And again, it gives really good context. See, look, the created user is called without any input validation, means the attacker can manipulate those values. It will basically inject, and then he shows then he says where the vulnerable methods, and now here's a nice class, right? A nice solution. So this is what basically the solution should look like. So this is actually a nice example of how to fix the vulnerability so you don't have actual SQL injection. Now, what's missing is a bit of the code. So I go, okay, so here's the front end for the ASCX component to change the password. I goes there, and then here it says, but then he goes again, ooh, I'm missing some of the code, which I feel it's an interesting limitation on the ChatGPT because I already provide the code above, but there's a limitation at the moment how much context it can hold. So I was going, okay, the implementation has been provided above, but here it is again. So that's the bit that is missing. And now he goes, okay, now the issues tell me that you now have the changes of password, which is basically going to cause the problem. And then he actually gives me the result with the fix. And by the way, and a lot of people say these different ways, but treat ChatGPT as a colleague, right? Like the same way that you're not rude to your colleagues or people you work with, always ask, nicely. There's no point of getting, and there's a guy who even said, if he starts to be rude or very sort of dismissive of ChatGPT in a way, it almost puts you in a different mindset, which is a not nice one. So in a way, I feel I'm talking to a colleague. So again, treat it with respect. So here's the punchline of all this is that I feel, and I had tons of examples that in the past months I've experienced where I can now put a lot of complex information on ChatGPT and is able to understand it, gives me context, and actually give me good guidance or even good validation for stuff that I probably, some of it I knew, some is references, and also things I can always double check if I need to, but it makes me way more productive. And this, you can see here the kind of relationship that I'm now starting to have where it's like a really good colleague. Right, and it's insane, the amount of context, the amount of effectiveness that you can do, and especially the fact that you can keep having a conversation. So crazy power. Now, that was co-review. Let's now look at the next one. So there's this guy who already did this really cool thing. So I'll expand these on later ones, but this is actually quite a nice example of how to use ChatGPT for threat modeling. And fundamentally is basically saying that ChatGPT understands what threat modeling is, and you can actually, for example, provide information to it, and then you can actually, for example, say, can you help with threat modeling? So he knows. Then, you can do, for example, a threat model for S3 bucket behind CloudFront, right? Now, this is where the more context you provide, the more specific and the better, in a way, the threat model will become. And I really wish I had this when I was doing lots of threat models, because it would save so much time. And look at this, how cool is you can say, hey, use Stripe. So there you go. Can you rewrite the thread using Stripe? There you go. Right. What about Thread? For the ones who remember when this was still happening around, there you go. right? So it's really, really cool, right? And I think this will, again, will make a massive difference, especially to jumpstart a lot of stuff. And where this is going to get really, really interesting is when we start to be able to generate this from code programmatically. So imagine a world where you have some analysis, either you've done it or you use ChatGPT or use other tools, or you basically say, here's what the code is actually doing. Then you say, okay, now give me a threat model. And you can even say, okay, here's the code that is actually doing in this context, in this environment, with this AWS config or Google Cloud or Azure or IBM, whatever you're using, right? With this particular configuration, in this particular set of attackers. And you can even say, this is the kind of threat actor that I'm worried about. What's the threat model now? That is insanely powerful. So, and I'm really looking forward to the next level of innovations that are going to happen here. Now, here's just a couple more little examples. Here's a dude that actually did some very interesting actually exploit development. And he's kind of like, it's like everything, ChatGPT tries to prevent very hard not to give exploits, but it's just about how you ask, right? So if you ask and provide codes, in this case for an ethical hacker, but provide codes for tests. So you can see that this guy went through all the different, basically, OWASP top 10, and actually was asking create complex payloads complex on the most, effective. So it's a really good example of, and this event, just to show that, you can use this if you're on the offensive side of things, unethical side of hacking, but also it's coming, especially with automation, especially with the old Auto GPT and those stuff. We are going to start to see a lot of much more effective and pivots, exploits in the short to medium term. So basically, you see that. I want to just say a couple words on this. So what I found, and this best way I can explain it, is I found myself realizing that when I use Google and Stack Overflow, I would almost try to describe the problem in a way that you would be able to understand it, and in a way that I could try to find at least some kind of answer that I still had to process. What is crazy powerful with ChatGPT, and even for security practices and activities, is I can now spend time describing the context. And then the result that I get is actually basically the actual code that exists. So for example, I was doing this review on JWT tokens, and I was literally having a dialogue about, okay, what about this? What about that? What's this token made of? What's the hash like? How is it protecting? And then there was one case so I was like, oh, okay, so it doesn't have expiry date. It's like, yeah. So then I was able to, almost zoom in on one of the vulnerabilities. And even when you ask for rewrites or ask for code, for example, I want to put that on a test. Okay, give me the code on this, and off he goes. In fact, a really cool trick is that if you go to Chrome and you copy a request as CURL, you can go to ChatGPT and say, hey, rewrite this in Python, and it will give you the exact code in Python. Because it's it would be nice if Chrome already did that, but it's a good example of, from a ChatGPT point of view, it's quite a trivial exercise to convert a CURL, quite complex, lots of cookies, lots of values, lots of stuff. Even if you want to obfuscate the company, usually you can if you don't want to send that token to ChatGPT. But it's really powerful to be able to say, rewrite it like this, rewrite it with this framework, rewrite it with that. Crazy powerful. So I find that at the moment it makes me a lot more efficient in a way I'm operating, which is also why Google is spending really a lot of focus on Bard and others, because it's a direct threat. So I've mentioned this. I think for cybersecurity experts, a great way to bounce off ideas, to basically to really zoom in on some of the context, get some great content that you could write, but why spend half an hour writing something where you could just get a lot of the raw content and then manipulate it a bit, or sometimes you don't even have to make a lot of changes, but it just makes you much more effective. This is something that I started to observe recently, and I think one of the impacts of these new technologies could have in our industry is we all talk about the problem of not having enough talent. We talk about skill shortages, we talk about not enough people joining the cybersecurity world. I think what we have is a problem of skills transfer. We need to bring a lot more people from other industries into cybersecurity. And the fact that those individuals who have a lot of other experience, they might be great managers, great engineers, great poets, great, whatever. And they have a lot of experience, working under pressure, maybe work for hospital, work for, all sorts of industries. When they come to security, there's definitely something to be said about not having some fundamentals or not having certain knowledge. But guess what? With tools like ChatGPT, they can start to ask really good questions and they get really good answers. So suddenly it's a great way for them to learn. So I think this would actually accelerate the possibility and the ability of talent to join the cybersecurity world. What that talent needs to have is the energy and the focus and the want and the drive to do something about it, to learn that. But if they do, I think these can be great tools. Like, for example, when people ask me certifications all the time, I think there's only a couple that are worth it. Sometimes, they're good to learn, but these days I go, well, spend your time and energy just querying and probing and showing samples and asking questions to ChatGPT. You probably will get a lot more out of that study time. And, for example, like creating security guidance. So, Sharif is doing some really cool experiments. And so he's basically had this really cool repo where he's basically starting to use, ChatGPT to create a lot of interesting content and to create a lot of analysis where I think this one is, take basically a bunch of languages, for each language describe the vulnerability and even to map CVEs to it. And it's really cool, right? Because it provides a lot of great guidance, a lot of great examples. So you can see here's the vulnerable code, and then this in Java, right? And then you go, and then the CWE on it, right? So it's really cool, right? And this is insanely powerful, right? Because this shows you how we start to do the stuff in context with for the audience. So all this stuff is in Java, but if you go down here, you got Python, same thing, right? So now you got examples, the same examples, but in Python. Super powerful, great way to start thinking about this. And you can see, look, there's the vulnerable code remediation. For the one of us who's been here for a while, like there was times where making this was crazy hard and crazy expensive, because the power here is you want to give developers and engineers and even business, but in this case, developers, a guidance in context. And this is a super powerful way of doing that. So I definitely advise you guys to play around with this, right? This is a no-specific chatbot. Again, some really cool stuff in here and a lot of great examples. So, take some time to go through this. And there's a presentation, which I'll show in a second. So there you go. Final thing, there's a great presentation that Sharif did, I think it was last week or so in London. The video's online. And also we've done a couple of great sessions here on the Open Security Summit on this. So again, check those out. And thanks. And send me feedback. Let me know what other areas I can look next. So we should explore. And I really want to do a number of panels. And what the one thing we know for sure is by the time the next summit come along, this whole field is going to have gone to another level. So I really look forward to seeing what comes next, and I see you guys around. Yeah, cool. Go for it. Hey, Sarah.
Hiya. So one of the questions I had as you were going through the presentation is that a lot of the examples you gave, and you were able to pick out where it was right and where it was wrong, and what you used it for was to save you time.
Yeah.
Now that's interesting because it means that unless you know what you're doing, you can't use it effectively. You can't identify where it's actually wrong.
Yeah, look, I think like everything, you could argue that a doctor, when he goes to find information, is his job to figure out which parts are good. I do think that with this you have to be careful because not all information is correct.
Yeah.
But I think there's two parts there. I think yes, for the expert, this dramatically accelerates you. It makes you more productive, makes a massive difference, allows you to scale a lot more. And I like it because it allows me to do things I always want to do that I could never do. Like I remember once going to my team and saying, hey guys, we need to transform this into 10 different presentations for 10 different stakeholders. And my team was like, whoa, you're crazy. In my head, it was like, actually it's 50, it's actually 500 presentations. But if they freak out with 10, I'm not going to tell them it's actually 50 that we should be doing, because you need to translate it to every layer of the organization, if you think about it. So this allows, really allows me to scale that. Even things like certain analysis of code base of environments. I always felt that without something like this, you don't have context. So, and now, look, imagine a world where you can feed your policies. You feed your policies, you feed GDPR, you feed ISO 27000, you feed, now your environment. You go, okay, what's the cases? You feed your risk register and you get context, right? That's coming next. But I also think, and I've seen this happening, that for the one that is not very good, even if there is 10% of it that is wrong, the ability to ask questions, the ability to get the guidance is already massive. So, it's almost like, so what if on that guidance, there's 10% wrong? To be honest, like even us as an industry won't fucking agree, right? I guarantee you that you actually have, 4 experts providing an answer and the other 4 will go, well, that's not entirely correct. And that's not entirely there. But I feel for the up and coming, it's an insane resource that gives you answers in context and doesn't force you to give them like the 500 pages of the testing guide and the 800 pages of ASVS extended and all that stuff and going, go through it because there's no context.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's good. Thank you.
Cool. But I think it's insanely powerful. And that picture that I had there with the worldly maps, where the big difference was the LLMs literally are commoditizing the LLM thing. And then now what you're going to see in the next 3 to 6 months is lots of security focused LLMs that, and in a way allows us to scale a lot more, allows us to actually get a lot more value from the tooling and from the information that we have collected. So I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I guess given the volume of standards and guidance frameworks we have in security, it's going to throw them all into a big bucket and make
but I think you can put them into context, right? Because the interesting question is always what matters to me. So in a way, actually, and I remember this with some of the OWASP materials, which is there's a catch-22. You either create something which is enough high level that is not insanely big and is consumable, but then that is not relevant because it doesn't have the detail. And then as soon as you go into the detail, you end up having thousands and thousands of pages, but it's too much. It's like the standards, they're good, but if you don't trim them, it doesn't make sense. The first thing I tend to do when I pick and we have to adopt a standard is almost going, what are the things that we're not going to do that we can argue against any auditor to say we don't do that because it's not relevant to us, right? But you need to do that at scale. So it's going to be interesting.
And that context is absolutely vital. Without the context, you're not going to get it.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff, man. All right, I'll see you on. I know you have a session later today, right? So I'll see you on that one. Brilliant.